Yeah, I don't know what I meant by number 3. Let me see. Yeah, I'm not sure. In fact, Christianity preserves the superstitious belief in divine dispensation. In fact, one needs only to see what tendencies the God of love inspires in his believers. Okay, they were for man. They were the beliefs or the tendencies for the sake of the good. Yeah, I'm not really sure what 3 means. Sorry. I'm not really sure. It's rare that's never happened before. I don't know what I meant by bullet point number 3. In fact, one need only to see what tendencies the God of love inspires in his believers. They were mankind for the sake of the good. No idea, sorry. And I wrote it wrong. That just came out. That came out bad. I can't follow my train of thought in that note. So, apologize. Skip number 3, jump to number 5. This stuff happens. Number 5. Quote, this universal law of man is in practice the preference for the suffering, right? Underprivileged, degenerate, right? This universal law of man. This idea in number 4 that the destruction of the species is the consequence, right? This is the consequence. Right? This is the consequence. The destruction of the species is the consequence. And obviously the mean, the method of arriving at this consequence is assuming an ideological basis that the natural is bad. And we've seen this time and time again throughout Nietzsche. If you believe that which is natural is a bad thing, and you believe this wholeheartedly, then your relationship to the biological is going to be to destroy the things that you see in front of you, right? So number 5 picks up in this train of thought, and I wish I really understood what I meant in 3, but whatever. Number 5 picks up in this train of thought. This is a quote from Note 246 in Nietzsche's Will to Power. This universal law of man is in practice the preference for the suffering, underprivileged, degenerate. He's told us this before, right? The Christian moral tradition, it exalts those who suffer, the meek, the weary, the poor, the degenerate, right? It has, in fact, lowered and weakened the strength, the responsibility, the lofty duty to sacrifice men. The species requires that the ill-constituted, weak, degenerate perish. This is starting to sound like social Darwinism, right? And I'm going to try to be charitable to note Nietzsche, but it does sound like social Darwinism. Granted, this would be one of the first accounts, right? This is obviously a philosophical account, but the idea to take Darwinian, sort of the Darwinian concept that Charles Darwin evolves or develops within Origin of Species, right? It's the same idea, right? The lofty duty to sacrifice those who are weak. And this is completely antithetical to this, which we saw in Note 4, or not Note 4, in bullet point number 4, right? So the species requires that the ill-constituted, weak, degenerate perish. But it was precisely to them that Christianity turned as a conserving force. This idea of being a conserving force we will return to later. Right? This idea of being a conserving force we'll return to later. Is further and to them that Christianity turned as a conserving force is further and danced the instinct in the weak. 246. I gotta check mine. The instinct in the weak, already so powerful, to take care and preserve themselves and to sustain one another. Right? So what we see is the idea of a conserving force, and the question is, well, what is trying to be conserved in the Christian moral tradition? What's being conserved is weakness. Right? The Christian moral tradition, according to Nietzsche, is and has been willfully, intentfully designed and constructed to preserve and protect the weak. Now, this doesn't sound like a bad thing, initially, right? To say that the system was built with the intent of protecting, securing, preserving, conserving the weak doesn't necessarily sound like a bad thing. What Nietzsche is saying is this attempt to preserve in sort of biological, he doesn't attempt to do it, and this might be a weakness in this sort of philosophical argument, is appealing to biology, and he should just appeal to logic. But his idea is this attempt to conserve that which is weak is anti-biological, because our biology and our state of affairs with respect to the process of natural selection is that nature selects the weak. It targets the weak, this is metaphorically speaking, it targets the weak and creates an environment where the weak cannot thrive. Therefore, the weak die out and the stronger survive, right? Only the strong survive, blah, blah, blah. I just did a video, two-part video series, a 3-hour discussion on the philosophy of hip-hop and war, and this is what I was hinting at this idea on many levels throughout the discussion. What he says is that Christianity is set in direct opposition to that selective process, right? Nature selects the weak, right? The lioness, in their pride, don't go after the main buck. It won't go after the strongest gazelle. It'll go after the youngest one who's lingering in the back, and the pride will annihilate that gazelle. They go after the weak, right? That's the point, and there's obviously a pro and con to this, right? There's a benefit to this analysis, and there's a detriment of this analysis, right? So, next point, 5a. 5a, Christianity is a conserving force for weakness, right? So Christianity is the conserving force for weakness. What we recognize, if you want to be sort of generous, right? If you want to give a charitable interpretation, human sacrifice can be understood when he says the species requires the ill-constituted weak degenerate to perish, to be sacrificed. This idea of perishing, this idea of sacrifice, could be interpreted to be charitable to Nietzsche in terms of sort of, remember we saw before in, I forget what video, maybe a few hours back in the series, I talked specifically and at length about the notion of free riding, and that Christians free ride on this closed system which they created, and they reap the benefits of the labor of others. And an example that I gave that was a gross generalization was to say that instead of actually going out and working for money, they'll hit you up for money. They'll be like, hey, I prayed to God and I asked God to give me, $100 so I can pay my rent, and that happened to coincide with my phone call to say, hey, can I have $100 to pay my rent? A person who works for that money gives the believer the $100 to pay for the. I know I'm doing a gross generalization, right? But this is, I can't go back and recap all the points. And then they use that money. Obviously, the real effort, the real work, was in going to work to make the money. The fake work, according to Nietzsche, is sitting around praying for money. That's not real work. It looks like you're working. You call it work, but it's not work. And I showed specifically, strategically, how Nietzsche justified this. This idea of to be charitable to Nietzsche, when we're talking about sacrifice, right, perishing as synonymous with sacrifice, we're talking about sacrificing, right, the species requires that the ill-constituted weak degenerate perish, that they be sacrificed. You could interpret this as saying, listen, and I think this is being very charitable to Nietzsche, and some might even say this is grossly a misnomer. Nietzsche's not saying that, which is fine. I don't really care. I leave this for you guys to make an assessment. I'm not really pushing an agenda per se. Nietzsche's saying, listen, those of you who have this Christian moral belief, right, you need to recognize that you are the weak, that you're not making contributions, and that you need to sacrifice. You need to allow that sort of, that free riding mentality to die. And you need to convert the way that you interact with the world so that you, and I actually think this is defensible, you interact with the world so that you can make meaningful contributions, that your work and your effort, that your sacrifice is of value into this